The Texas sun was merciless that summer, baking the earth into cracked, thirsty clay. Miles of empty plains stretched in every direction, broken only by stubborn mesquite trees and the occasional rattle of wind through dry grass. Life here wasn't for the faint of heart. It belonged to the kind of men who didn't just endure hardship but wore it like a second skin. Ethan Callahan was one of those men. A lone rancher, he had carved out a modest life on the edge of Comanche territory, tending a herd of half-wild cattle and living in a cabin he had built with his own calloused hands. Folks in the nearest town, 2 days' ride south, knew him as quiet, dependable, and stubborn as the soil itself. He kept to himself, not out of pride, but because loss had taught him the fragility of bonds. His wife, Clara, had died in childbirth 5 years before, and since then, silence had been his companion. That silence broke one evening. Ethan was mending a fence when he heard it, a faint cry, sharp and quick, carried on the dry wind. He froze, hammer in hand. Out here, a cry could mean many things: a wounded animal, a lost traveler, or something far more dangerous. Slowly, he set down the hammer and reached for the Winchester leaning against the fence post. The sound came again, weaker this time. Against his better judgment, Ethan followed it, his boots crunching over brittle grass. A half-mile out, in a shallow gully hidden from the open plain, he found her. A young Comanche girl, no more than 16, lay crumpled against a rock. Her leg was torn and bloodied, a crude arrow snapped off and lodged deep in her thigh. Her breathing was shallow, her dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. She gripped a stone in her hand as though she would fight him if he came closer. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Every frontier instinct screamed at him to walk away. Helping her could mean trouble, grave trouble. If her people found her here, found her with him, they would assume the worst. The fragile peace between settlers and Comanche was held together by little more than thread, and a single misunderstanding could light a fire that would burn for miles. But Ethan saw something else in her eyes: pain, yes, but also a desperate will to live. He thought of Clara, how helpless he had felt as she slipped away, and of the child he had buried beside her, a life ended before it had even begun. He couldn't walk away from someone clinging to life, not again. He knelt, slowly, speaking in a low voice even though he doubted she would understand. "Easy now. I'm not here to harm you." The girl hissed through her teeth, clutching the stone tighter. Ethan raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. Then, with deliberate calm, he took off his bandana, dipped it in his canteen, and held it out. She hesitated, suspicion etched into every line of her face. But thirst won out. She snatched the cloth and pressed it to her lips. Ethan worked quickly after that. He broke the arrow, pulled it free, and bound the wound with strips torn from his shirt. The girl endured it in silence, though tears streaked her dusty cheeks. When he tried to lift her, she weakly resisted, but Ethan's voice was steady. "You won't last the night out here. I've got food, shelter. You'll be safe, safe." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he made it anyway. He carried her back to his cabin, her small frame light against his broad shoulders. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire, Ethan laid her gently on his bed and lit a lantern. He didn't know her name, her story, or what danger might follow her. All he knew was that fate had set her in his path, and he had chosen compassion over fear. Out there, somewhere in the vast darkening plains, riders might already be looking for her. But for this one night, beneath the roof of a solitary rancher's cabin, a wounded Comanche girl was no longer alone. And Ethan Callahan, for the first time in years, felt the quiet stirrings of purpose. The girl stirred restlessly through the night, her fever burning as fiercely as the oil lamp that flickered beside the bed. Ethan sat nearby, dipping a rag into cool water and pressing it against her brow. He had done the same years ago when Clara's fever had raged, whispering promises that had gone unanswered by the heavens. Now he whispered nothing, only worked in silence, his jaw set, as though sheer determination could keep death from claiming another soul under his roof. By dawn, her breathing steadied. Ethan, exhausted but relieved, stepped outside to clear his head. The morning was quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight. He scanned the horizon and noticed faint tracks near the ridge, horse tracks. Fresh. His gut tightened. Whoever had wounded the girl wasn't far, and it was just as likely that her own people would come searching. Either way, trouble was circling. When he returned inside, she was awake, her dark eyes fixed on him with guarded suspicion. Ethan knelt by the bedside, speaking slowly, pointing to himself. "Ethan," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. "Ethan." She blinked, then whispered a word in Comanche, her voice hoarse. He couldn't understand it, but he knew it was her name. He repeated it clumsily, and for the first time, a faint flicker of something other than fear crossed her face. Trust, perhaps. Over the next 2 days, a fragile rhythm settled between them. Ethan cooked simple meals, beans, bread, a little venison jerky, and though she ate sparingly, her strength began to return. She watched him with sharp curiosity as he moved about the cabin, mending tools, tending to chores, as though studying the life of a man who lived entirely alone. Ethan, in turn, noticed her resilience. Even injured, she tried to rise, to walk, to prove she was not helpless. There was fire in her spirit, the kind that refused pity. He admired that. It reminded him of Clara, who had once faced hardship with that same quiet defiance. But the peace was fragile. On the third evening, as Ethan was chopping wood near the barn, he spotted dust rising on the horizon. Riders. At least a dozen, maybe more. He froze, his axe hovering in the air. The distance was too far to make out details, but his heart sank. Comanche scouts. They were searching. He returned to the cabin, his expression grave. The girl saw it instantly. She tried to rise from the bed, gripping the wall for support. Fear and resolve battled in her eyes, and though Ethan couldn't understand her words, he understood her meaning well enough. "They're coming for me." Ethan paced, his mind torn. If the riders found her here, they might assume he had taken her captive or, worse, harmed her. No amount of explanation would save him. Yet turning her out was unthinkable. She wouldn't last an hour on her wounded leg. That night, he barely slept. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, the wide plains stretched before him like a sea of shadows. Coyotes howled in the distance. Every rustle of wind sounded like hoofbeats. As the stars burned overhead, Ethan wrestled with the weight of his choice. He had always lived by simple rules. Don't meddle in trouble that isn't yours, keep your word, and protect what's under your roof. That last rule was the one binding him now. The girl was under his roof. Her life depended on his courage, not his fear. By morning, the riders' tracks were closer. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. He went inside, where the girl sat on the bed, braiding her dark hair with trembling fingers. She met his eyes, as if asking the question neither of them dared to speak. "What will you do when they come?" Ethan knelt before her, his weathered hand resting on the edge of the bed. "I don't know your words, but hear mine," he said softly. "I won't hand you over. Not to die. Not while I still draw breath." She didn't understand his language, yet something in his voice reached her. Slowly, she placed her hand over his. For the first time since she had arrived, her eyes softened. Trust had replaced fear. And just as the fragile bond was forged, the distant thunder of hooves rolled across the plains.